Hello everybody and welcome back. And the party are here at the Scange camp and they've acquired about 4 prisoners who are chained up and are going to be escorted back to Riflean to face justice. The river will be safer from today onwards. We have 2 boats. We have the Bandits river boat and of course we have the boat that we came on. We have a bit of a shortage of crew members. 2 of them died in the attack. The boatswain was the second in command and 4 of the crew members will take these prisoners with some irony in their own boat back to Riflean, which means the party are going to have to take turns rowing. Liz and Malin are really not cut out for rowing, so they will take turns and shifts. Carrick will have to sit on a box because he's a bit too short for the oars and the seat. But nonetheless, with a bit of grumbling, we are going to go northward on our way to Threshold and we can put all of this behind. It's getting into the afternoon and the sun is here, which means we don't really see anything even though we're facing backwards, rowing upstream. It's difficult to see into the sun, but something passes over the sun and appears here and zips northward in the sky. It's a rectangle shaped thing with 2 people sitting on it. It's low enough for us to see the passengers, and that will mean that it's close enough for the passengers to look and see us. Liz and Malin recognise this as Cardia and her flying carpet, who has a business in Threshold, and we can see something of her passenger. It's a figure dressed in yellow, a yellow robe, and that's enough to make the party go, oh god, Golthar. There's a good chance he's going north to Threshold. Stephen grits his teeth, there's justice to be served, and he might get his opportunity. So we're going to go north to Threshold, and it will take us the rest of the day. So the evening is setting in and the torches are being lit around the dockside and in certain streets, and fires and lamplights can be seen appearing in the windows as the sun sets. 3 of our heroes are from here. Liz and Malin were born and brought up here. Donard took up residence as a cleric, though he has spent most of his time cloistered up in the monasteries. Carrick has been here before. If you remember, we met him first as a retainer who helped us through Castle Mistemere. Stephen has never been here. He has no need to come this far north. He is a horse trader and the lands that supply him with his livelihood are far to the south. So there's going to be a lot of mixed feelings as the boat rounds a corner and Threshold comes into view. So what do we know about Threshold? Well, the main source is the expert book, which lists Threshold as the hometown. This is odd because the Night's Dark Terror recommends that your parties do not come from here. We will have to reconcile that. In fact, the description of Threshold given in the Night's Dark Terror follows this closely, including Cardia's carpet service. I find that a bit whimsical, but nonetheless, it's there. Right, we're told that this is a village of 500 humans. In the Gazetteer, which supported the campaign world, this got upgraded to 5,000, which seems more plausible given the fact they're meant to be industries and different districts of the actual settlement. It lists here commerce, things which are shipped to Threshold and the sort of things it supplies. It does have a lot of exotic goods here, whereas I've always described Threshold as being a bit of a frontier backwater where fancy goods are rare. And if there are any fancy goods that come in, then the wealthiest people get first dibs on them. So Liz has always grumbled that most of the real world just passes them by. We're given a few more details here. We're told Patriarch Shirlane, who is mentioned in the expert book, is a 14th level cleric and he has a lakeside castle called Tarn's Keep. The town is lawful. You can only carry daggers and swords, excluding 2-handed swords and staves. Prohibited weapons are confiscated. I do think, since this town seems to be a bit of a theocracy, I don't know if that's the right term for the fact that the mayor is a priest. But you would think that members of the church who are limited to blunt weapons would be able to carry a warhammer or a mace, especially if they're expected to sometimes keep the peace. So I'm going to allow Donard to carry his warhammer because he is part of the church, and I've called it the Church of Traladar, which has a main church in Specularum. if you remember. There are limitations to wearing armour. It is legal, but it will draw attention. And magic user spells are banned. Okay. And there are some, again, whimsical, nonsensical curses like hair loss and pimples as punishments, though they do escalate quite quickly. It isn't made clear whether this patriarch dislikes magic users or distrusts public spellcasting. I don't think he can, in a world like this, be that discriminatory. I think he will accept that spellcasters do exist, and he might even be friends with some. He's not a magist. Some of his best friends are mages. And we have this very nice drawing of Threshold, though it doesn't fit in with the images that I had of it, which looked more like a wooden and stone frontier place. I have on occasion been to places like Bruges and Berg in Northern Europe, and a cliche is, wow, it's like a living museum, or it's like stepping back in time. And in certain places it really is. But those were wealthy, large centres. I'm going to downgrade Threshold to be a bit more rough and ready. Even the church is made of wood, and I found a nice picture for that right at the beginning. So the party is pulling into the wharf, and there's a lot of mixed feelings about coming back home after so many months. It's up to Captain Skyla and his crew to deal with all the goods that are on the boat. He's got some stories to tell the dockhands about why they're so short-staffed. The first topic of conversation when the party disembark is Donard says that he is duty-bound to go back to his own church and stay there and to catch up with his elders. And he says to Liz and Malin, I suppose you might be wanting to stay with your mother and father, which means, can you help the other two, Carrick and Stephen, to find a good inn? But Malin has spent his time when he was not rowing, rifling around his backpack, and he opens his hand and he pulls out a large key. And the others look at it and they recognise it, and they say, yes, Ben's house. And indeed, Ben has a fine house. Apart from Fogor Isle, which is described as the slums and under the control of the Thieves Guild, the rest of the town has not really been carved into districts, and it's likely that this part of town will be the nice area. This part of town close to the docks will not be the nice area. Northern part is probably the middling area, with the poor people this end and the wealthier that end. But Ben has a fine house somewhere here, and Carrick has been in it before, Malin has been in it before, Sylvia has as well. The last time that Malin and Carrick were there, the place was covered in dust and dirt. It looked like an abandoned, forgotten place. The only two pieces of furniture not covered in dust were Ben's old armchair that sat facing the fire and a special trunk that he had where he kept all his old adventuring stuff and clearly lived out his days wallowing in nostalgia. Now since then, when Sylvia arrived in, Ben decided to splash some cash and get the whole place cleaned up, and it looked incredible. It was brought back to its original fine self. Nobody here knows that part, so they will be surprised when they make it through all these city streets to discover that when they open the door, Ben's house is quite spectacular. Especially Liz is quite astonished, since her image of Ben was anything but spectacular. And it will have accumulated about 6 months of light dust, the kind of dust you would expect in a closed off room. And they discover that the ground floor has several large rooms. There is a hallway, there is the main living room with the huge fireplace and the long dining table, there's a parlour, and there is a large enough kitchen with its own fireplace and all the spits and stakes you would expect there to be to cook over the fire. They go upstairs and find a long corridor, and there seems to be at least about 6 bedrooms, which is more than good enough. And they also discover a room that has a large, well, it looks like half a barrel that's been sawn across its middle. This is something that Liz and Malin would not have seen before, but all their adventures, especially in the Keep on the Borderlands, they recognise this as a bathtub. So despite Ben's image, he had a bathtub. All of this seems to be too good to be true, and each of the bedrooms is well furnished with a good bed, so it's a case of just pick your room. So Donard will leave them, they know where the church is and they know how to ask for him. And so it has come to the evening, so the party are going to settle in Ben's house, which is now Malin's house. And of course, they're going to talk about what happens next. How long will they stay here for? Do they need to rest? And they have to wait for Sylvia. And what will they do when they go to the Lost Valley, if they can find it? And where did Golthar go? Was Golthar going to the Lost Valley? Was he going to Tarn's Keep? Is he in Threshold? And of course, Liz and Malin think about their parents, who live about here, in a place that's not that great, and they were very glad to get away from. And they realise they could install their parents in this fine house and let them live out the last of their years in a certain amount of grandeur. Well, we'll see how all that goes, and indeed, we'll see what tomorrow brings, because both Donard and Liz can take this time while they're waiting for Sylvia to engage in their own weapons training. So let's review that. Right, I have in front of me here the weapons mastery table, and it will give you the costs. Now, currently, Liz and Donard began with basic skill in 2 weapons. Donard had Warhammer and Sling, and Liz had Short Sword and Short Bow. Go from basic to skilled, it cost them 500 gold and 2 weeks, and there was a 70% chance of success because they had an expert trainer. They have 3 options here. They could either pick up a new weapon and become basic in it, they could become skilled in their alternative weapon, or they could try and go for expertise in the weapon that they trained in. So I'll go briefly over the pros and cons of each. To pick up a new skill might be handy for Donard because the game throws an awful lot of magical maces at you, but it hasn't yet to give us a magical warhammer. I have had to adapt every magical mace into a warhammer simply because, well, it seems to be a forgotten weapon, and definitely the game is pro mace. So I could continue doing that. If we find another magical mace, I could just claim it to be a warhammer. I mean, I can do that, I'm the DM. Or alternatively, he could get a basic skill in a mace. The other alternative is he becomes skilled with his sling. Now, Donard does not like a sling. He doesn't have the patience to hold back, especially when he can wade in there. But having some ranged skill might be good. Now, had he got a really bad armor class and a really bad constitution and was a lot more fragile, he would definitely be on the back line a lot more using the sling. That did not turn out to be the case. He's got an amazing constitution and a great armor class. He is a tank. The third option is he becomes expert. This has 2 problems. Firstly, he is only going to have access to an expert trainer, which lowers the odds to 40%. Becoming expert takes 4 weeks and 2,000 gold. Money is no option, but the time is, so that is not going to happen. So he has to choose either to get a basic skill in the mace or become skilled in the sling, and we can work that one out in a while. Liz has much the same issues. She's got 2 weapons. She could train in a third. I don't see why she would. She is quite fragile, and therefore she has become quite good with her bow. If she became skilled with her short sword, she would gain an extra +2 to hit and damage, which would make her backstab ability much more viable, especially as she becomes better at stealth. And again, she could become expert in the short bow. Now, the other thing about becoming expert is this training can begin at level 3, and the extra 2 to hit and damage has proved very useful at low levels. It will become less useful as the party level up, so it might be more appropriate to become expert at level 9 when basic skill loses its potency. But at the stage they're at, this skilled level, the extra +2 to hit and damage, is more than good enough. So I think it's quite clear that she's going to try get trained in the short sword and become skilled. So she will move from 1d6 to 1d6 +2. And it's also, for those who don't know this system, the backstab damage modifier never changes. It's always a ×2 multiplier. It never increases to ×3. There may be a piece of equipment later on that does increase that multiplier. I think that is unlikely. The backstab, it's not that great. It is great at low levels, and the only way it can become better is if your thief is incredibly strong, which Liz is not, or else has good modifiers and good weapons. And Malin himself might decide to become skilled in the dagger because he does like a throwing dagger, and that makes sense. So there might be a lot of training going on here. Malin did not take up that opportunity when he was level 3, but it's still on the cards for him. As the party will be biding their time in Threshold, they're going to try and make good use of that time. Yes, I think we'll do it. That Donard will train in the sling, Liz in the short sword, and Malin with the throwing dagger. And they have more than enough money and 2 weeks to do that in. Right. With all of those formalities out of the way, what will weapons training actually look like? Well, Threshold has a barracks where they obviously train their own soldiers, and they offer courses. I don't know if you would call it a course in those days, but they will offer the training. Stephen himself is also eligible for training. He is level 5 and he can train in a normal sword. So training isn't going to take 16 hours a day. It might take 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, while the rest of the day is your own, over a period of 2 weeks. So there is plenty of time for everybody to get together and discuss what happens next. And also to go through the bits and pieces in the module. I also have a list of things which are going to happen in Threshold, which are unrelated to the actual adventure. So yes, there is plenty to happen in the 2 weeks when they aren't training. So Malin is going to train in a dagger. He shows up at the barracks, and of course the captain of the guard just sort of gives him a curious look. He's not the strongest person, and it shows. Donard is going to train in the sling. And again, well, that's quite embarrassing. It's not really seen as a martial weapon. Stephen is going to train in the sword, and well, that's approved. Now Liz's training will be very different, and we will get onto that later. But let us throw our percentage rolls, and we need a 70% or less to see if anybody becomes skilled. And we will start with Malin. And he throws a 7. For a minute I thought that was 70. It's a 7. So yes, Malin succeeds in the dagger. Donard, who hates a sling and is going into this training almost predestined to fail. Well, he doesn't. And Stephen, who, despite being level 5, let's see what happens to him. And that's a 79. He fails. Oh well, Stephen, we'll be dumping you after this adventure is over. Let's just read up a bit on what these changes mean. The sling at basic is 1d4. We don't like a 1d4, do we? That is now a 1d6. That's much better. And a dagger goes up to 1d6. Remember that Malin will lose 1 point for his -1 strength penalty. So that is 1d6 -1, better than 1d4. Okay, so in terms of leveling up, that's actually quite modest, since both Donard and Malin rarely use those weapons. Shame about Stephen. Now Liz, however, they don't offer short sword training at the barracks, especially when it comes to doing backstabbing. In fact, they kind of disapprove of a thief being there, so she is turned away. If you remember, Liz has a friend who has got an older brother who hangs around on Fogor Isle. Her friend is called Cassie, who is the same age, and her elder brother is called Gus. And of course, when they were about 16 years old, Liz and Cassie thought it was great to hang out with the older boys in the bad part of town. And it was actually Gus who gave Liz her first set of thieves' tools. So she meets up with her old friend Cassie. They're all a bit older. They're no longer 16, of course. That was some time ago. And they go and visit Gus and his friends in Fogor Isle. And these guys are lounging about a tavern without much to do. And of course, Gus is always delighted to see his sister, and they're more than delighted to see Liz now that she's grown up a bit. And Liz explains what she wants. She wants to know, can she get more training in a short sword and even a few tips on how to backstab people. Now the other guys that are at the inn are clearly affiliated with the Thieves Guild, and they all have the regulation leather armour on, and they look at Liz's leather armour, which is slightly fancier, but is covered with all the scars and holes from being shot and stabbed. Gus remarks with, "That armour has seen some mileage. What state was its previous owner in?" And Liz just says there was no previous owner. She thinks that's a slightly condescending remark, but then she checks herself and remembers that from the point of view of these people who live in Threshold and rarely leave it, that is probably the most likely explanation. She has to see that they aren't being patronising. That is how Liz appears to them. And of course, they all catch up with good times, and Gus, who's got a small, dingy apartment with his thieving friends here, talk about how good it is that they can pickpocket the odd member of the nobility and the odd merchant that does come through, and especially at the docks when there's money changing hands, and that pays for their lifestyle. And it just dawns on Liz just how much wealthier and more experienced she is, despite all her grumbles at being shot, at being stabbed, falling down pits, being attacked by zombies, creeping through demonic temples, sleeping in bushes. You know, it's paid off. So she has a lot to think about. To answer her question, can she find any training? The guys around the table just give a low whistle and shake their head and say, you know, you have to be pretty high up in the Thieves Guild for that kind of stuff. And Liz says, well, how do you become high up in the Thieves Guild? And again, all the guys look at each other and shake their heads, and again whistle and say, well, you have to meet the head honcho, and he's probably going to make you go through the brig. And of course, Liz has never heard of the brig, and neither has her friend Cassie. So what is the brig? And again, that's met with another series of head shaking and exasperation. If you don't know what the brig is, then it's not for you. So Liz insists, just tell us what the brig is. And the brig is a large basement underneath a warehouse and several other buildings that's been turned into a cross between a maze and an assault course for thieves. And if you want to become established in the Thieves Guild rather than just an associate, you have to get through the brig and pass all the tests. Well, Liz says, I'm up for that, and that causes everybody else to laugh. And again, she has to bite her tongue because she realises from their point of view, you don't just show up in a tavern in a small town and claim that you can go through the brig and survive it. But they're going to humour her, and so they will escort her to the master of the Thieves Guild and introduce her, and he can assess whether or not she is fit to try the brig. So that's what's going to happen next. Right, I will end this session here. Liz was taken to the head of the Thieves Guild, and unlike Gus and his friends, this guy is well travelled. And as always with the Thieves Guild, nothing is as it seems. His house looks like a ramshackled, dilapidated slum, but inside it is like a mansion with wood-panelled walls and leather furniture and a well-stocked wine cabinet. And he takes Liz to the basement and he opens the door into a long corridor of wooden walls, and he points to a dagger stuck in the wall with a note attached. Liz reads the note and it says, "Watch your step." And he points to it and says, "There are several of these, read them." And then he says, "I will see you at the other end." And he shuts the door and leaves Liz to survive the brig. And if she does survive it, she will get her weapons training. Okay, well, we'll see how all of that goes next time. I'll see you then.